Okay. Hello. Um, okay. So, um, I guess before I start, are there questions about the final paper or anything like that? Okay, I don't see anything. All right. So today we're talking about the so-called second inquiry. Oops. Um, right. The first inquiry was the inquiry concerning the human understanding, or concerning on concerning the human understanding. And the second inquiry is the inquiry concerning the principles of morals. And as I said before, the second inquiry, just as the first inquiry, is basically a rewrite of book one of the treatise. The second inquiry is basically a rewrite of book three of the treatise, which is about morals and politics. Um, And there also is another essay he published on the passions that was kind of a rewrite of book two of the treatise. So, so basically, we've gone on now to start doing the type of thing that he said at the end of book one of the treatise, right? He said, well, but when a mood of serious good humor returns to me, then um, I'm tempted once again to try to solve these issues about politics and morals. And that's what he's talking about here. Um, and the main, trying to segue into this, um, the, the way he's considering the issues of morals or ethics, I think he uses those terms interchangeably, um, is um, by asking this question: what is the true origin of morals? So, what does he mean by that? Well, basically, um, he starts off by pointing out or asserting that we all tend to think some actions and some characters are entitled to praise and others are deserve blame. And that's the basic topic here. So, morals means the way we ascribe praise and blame to actions and characters. Um, and for the most part in this book, his main focus is on characters, right? That is like what personal characteristics we consider virtuous and what we consider vicious, what we think of as virtues and what we think of as vices. Um, so this is the subject. We shall analyze that complication of mental qualities. So it's mental qualities that entitle us to praise and blame. He is limiting it that way. In other words, if we can be praised or blamed for looking beautiful or being strong or something like that, that's outside his subject here. But that's the only limitation he draws. So we shall analyze that complication of mental qualities which form what in common life we call personal merit. We shall consider every attribute of the mind which renders a man an object either of esteem and affection or of hatred and contempt. Every habit or sentiment or or faculty which, if ascribed to any person, implies either praise or blame, and may enter into any panegyric or satire of his character and manners. Right, so the topic here is morals considered very broadly. It means whatever mental characteristics we think are deserving of praise or blame. And the question is, I'm sorry, my power cord keeps filling up. And the question about the origin of them then is, what do all those characters or actions have in common? What do all the praiseworthy ones have in common? And what do all the blameworthy ones have in common? Right? What is it about those characters or actions which determines which, if either of those, we assign to them? So, and Hume says this can't be a bad question. Now, I mean, it could be a bad question in the sense that if we really assume that there is one origin of all of these things, right, that there's exactly one thing about a character or action that makes it praiseworthy, or the opposite of which makes it blameworthy. And in fact, Hume is actually going to conclude that there isn't just one, that there's a series of related reasons why we attach praise and blame to mental characteristics, although there's one main one, so to speak. But other than that, Hume says this can't be a bad question because we certainly do praise some actions and blame others, right? And that's why he says at the very, or towards the very beginning, in section 1 on page 13, that no one can seriously dispute the reality of morals or the reality of moral distinctions. The reality of moral distinctions just means that, as a matter of fact, we don't praise or blame everything equally. There are some things that we praise and some things that we blame, some more than others, and there are some that we don't praise or blame. So this reality, it's not like the reality of primary qualities, according to Locke, where we say the primary qualities are real. We mean they have objective reality, that is something in the object of, in that case, the object of the understanding, right? Something in the object of knowledge corresponds to those qualities. It means just that what Hume is taking for granted and saying no one can deny is subjective reality of moral distinctions, right? Like whether or not there's something that all the objects have in common, there definitely is something, there definitely is a difference in me between things that I praise and things that I blame. So that's the question. The question about the origin is, right? Like, so the question is not about the origin, is not like what's the historical origin, although he does discuss some things about that, or, you know, what's the origin as you're growing up, your education, whatever, although he does discuss some things about that. The question is just like, you know, as we are now going around assigning praise and blame to things, look at those things. What do they have in common? Um, and Hume says this is a question of fact. Um, Meaning, uh, um, the only way to tell is to look empirically at what things we attach praise to and what things we attach blame to. And from that, you'll be able to determine, by the usual empirical methods, what it is they have in common. So the question, what is the origin of morals, is an empirical question that should be answered by observations. Um, and that means that it's a question of fact, means, of course, that it's not a question of reason, strictly speaking, or relation of ideas. That is, it's not going to turn out to be logically impossible. Hume is saying, assuming, thinking to be obvious. It's not going to turn out to be logically impossible that we could assign praise and blame differently than we do. Right? It could be, just as we can imagine the two balls going together and instead of bouncing back, one of them stopping and the other one shooting up that way or whatever. We can imagine people encountering the things that we think are, that we find worthy of praise and blaming them instead, and vice versa. So in that sense, this way of setting out the question is empiricist rather than rationalist. But I hesitate a little bit to go into this because I'm afraid you may find what I'm about to say confusing, but I think it's important. Um, um, so this is a question of fact, so not of reason. It's not to be attacked by abstract reasoning, deduction from axioms, whatever. But this is not actually the same as the question that he first talks about in section 1, which is whether the foundation of morals is sentiment or reason. So this is the way he well, okay, so let me show why these are clearly not the same. Two same questions, and it's confusing because they are both about something versus reason, and something versus reason about morals. But the first one, actually, let me switch back to that for 1 second. This one is a question about what the method should be to answer the question, the origin of morals. This one is about it's debate about like what we actually use to notice the origin of morals. Right? Like there's something that all these acts have in common. How do we tell whether they have it in common or not? And these people, as Hume presents them, are arguing whether we tell by the feeling we get from them or by some reasoning we conduct about them. Um, so let me switch back to this again. So this is the argument that the sentiment camp makes. Is this ever to be expected from inferences and conclusions of the understanding? This means, well, actually, let me just skip a little bit. Inferences and conclusions of the understanding of themselves have no hold of the affections or set in motion the active powers of men. They discover truths, but where the truths they discover are indifferent and beget no desire or aversion, they can have no influence on conduct and behavior. So the people in the sentiment camp say, look, whatever it is the praiseworthy actions have in common, it must be something that makes us want to behave in a certain way towards the people who carry them out. It must be something that makes us want to treat them in a certain way. So it must be something that inspires our love of those people and therefore inspires us to do good things for them. And vice versa. The ones that are blameworthy, in other words, praise and blame aren't really praise and blame unless they're connected to love and hatred, is what the sentiment camp is arguing here. And they're saying that no matter how much abstract reasoning you do, you can never conclude that you should love or hate something. So on the one hand, this argument itself is not empiricist, right? I mean, this is about relations of ideas, basically. It's saying that to count as the origin of morals, whatever it is we find to be the origin has to be something that immediately inspires a passion of love or hatred in us. And that can't be deduced. It's an impression. It's not an idea that the mind can produce as the conclusion of a deduction. So actually, this argument in favor of this camp is not empiricist. And on the other hand, what they're ruling out here under the title of reason is not only, oh, sorry, I'm pointing at the board again and you can't see me. Right? The argument of the sentiment camp is not empiricist, even though what they're arguing is that it's something like sensations, impressions that lie behind our moral judgments. They don't actually conclude that empirically. And on the other hand, what they're ruling out here, which would constitute the reason camp, would include not only demonstrative reasoning, but also empirical conclusions, right? Like, just as no amount of deductions from axioms could ever make you love or hate something, no amount of mere observations of it could make you love or hate something. There has to be, ultimately, you either have to experience or imagine something that in a primary way is pleasant or unpleasant. That's the sentiment camp. The reason camp is going to reply that that's all very well, but we don't treat moral questions as if they were just a matter of how do you feel, right? We make lots of arguments about them. So the reason camp's argument is actually empiricist. I said this might confuse you. So I mean, Hume notes both of these arguments, says they're both good arguments, so the chances are they both have there's something right about both conclusions. And then, for the time being, just drops the whole question in this form and goes back to this empirical method of saying, well, look, what is it actually that they have in common? Once we know that, I think Hume says we'll be able to tell pretty easily whether it's something we arrive at by feeling it or deducing it. Okay. So I guess, I mean, there's two immediate things to say about this, and then a third thing that's less immediate. So the two immediate things to say about this are that, of course, right, the sentiment camp is arguing that all these rational methods can ever produce is cool assent or belief. They can never produce a passion or impression. But we know, actually, remember that according to Hume, in a stricter mood, belief itself is only a kind of sentiment. Right? It's like a cooler, more regular kind of sentiment, but it's a kind of increased vivacity that an idea gets by being associated with an impression. So, so I guess, Hume, in a stricter sense, would have to rephrase the sentiment argument a little bit. It's I mean, the idea that we believe, that is, of which we get that more lively impression, does have a stronger hold on our actions than the merely imagined idea. But I think what the sentiment camp wants to say is that still it can't determine us to one action or another without something additional. I don't know. Maybe that's not worth worrying about so much. Here's the other second note I wanted to make about this immediately. So what I just said means is that although it kind of looks like Hume is like giving empiricists and rationalists a hearing, and I mean, even though, and this is tricky, and he must notice this. So, like, on the one hand, the people he quotes on this side are basically people we would think of as empiricists. And the people he quotes on this side are basically people we'd think of as rationalists. He doesn't mention any of the famous empiricists or rationalists in this connection, but he mentions Shaftesbury on this side and Malebranche and Cudworth and some others on this side. So, I mean, there's the appearance of giving the empiricists a say, and then letting the rationalists make their argument and saying there's something to both sides. Even though, as I pointed out, the so-called empiricists actually make a rationalist argument, and the so-called rationalists actually make an empiricist argument. That's the argument Hume puts into their mouths. As a matter of fact, when he goes to attack the question, he's already decided in favor of empiricism. Not this question, right? That is, in other words, putting the question this way makes it, so to speak, an empirical question whether the empiricists or rationalists are right. The question is, empirically speaking, do we assign praise or blame as the result of arguments or as the result of feelings? But what's got left out of this is a true rationalist theory of morals, which would say it doesn't matter what people actually praise or blame. you can deduce what they should praise or blame. Right. So Hume is so that like actual rationalist position, which would say it's not a question of fact, and no matter how many examples you give of people praising murder of innocence, which you could probably find plenty, right? No matter how many examples you give of that, you'll never show that that's worthy of praise. You'll just show that a lot of people are wrong. That would be a true rationalist position, and Hume doesn't even give that a chance to speak here. Okay, those are the two notes I wanted to make about this, but then other questions so far? Um, okay, so the last thing I wanted to point out is what the asking of this question about morals shows about what Hume is doing. And uh, so Hume says to begin with, um, this is in section 1, page 14. So, let's go back. The end of all moral speculations is to teach us our duty, and by proper representations of the deformity of vice and beauty of virtue, beget correspondent habits, and engage us to avoid one and embrace the other. This is put in the mouth of the sentiment camp, but it seems like Hume is agreeing with it. He doesn't raise an objection to it. The proper use of the proper end of all moral speculations is to teach us to be moral. So actually, maybe I put the sentiment camp's argument a little bit wrong earlier. I was saying, although this is true, I think, they're not basing it on the fact that we must love the person we praise and hate the person we blame. They're basing it on the fact that whatever causes us to praise something should also motivate us to try to be that way. Maybe those are almost the same. I don't know. Anyway, but the point is, the sentiment camp is saying, and Hume doesn't seem to be disputing this, that the end of talking about morals in the end should be to make people more moral. Should be, in what sense? That's going to be the part of the problem about this. It means it would be praiseworthy to do it for that end, I guess. But in any case, that's how Hume at first makes us expect what the topic of the Book of Morals would be. It would be to make it seem attractive to be virtuous and not to be vicious. But then, as Hume goes on, he says about himself, that he's concerned here about the speculative and not the practical side of morals. And I mean, considering this question obviously doesn't point us in that direction, right? The way the question has been phrased, I have to assume that everybody already agrees on classifying characters and actions as praiseworthy and blameworthy. I mean, not that they agree 100%, and not that everyone everywhere agrees for sure, but at least that I and my audience are largely agreed, so that if I can say, for example, this is something we would praise, everyone who's reading me is going to say, oh yeah, that's something we would praise, right? So that has to be taken for granted. So this isn't really the question you want to ask if you want to convince people to be moral. This is a question that assumes that people already know what they want or don't want to do, but you're going to tell them why. And sure enough, a little bit later on, Hume is going to say, this is in section 2 on page 17. So after he starts saying all these great things about the virtue of benevolence, right? The virtue of benevolence is the virtue of being nice to people, doing good things for other people. Pretty simple. So he spends like several paragraphs saying how wonderful benevolence is. And then he says, but I forget that it is not my present business to recommend generosity and benevolence, or to paint in their true colors all of the genuine charms of the social virtues. Right? Meaning he forgets. Now, of course, this is the exact same kind of trick that I keep pointing out in Hume's writing. If he really forgot and realized he had written something that wasn't on the point, he could have just erased it. He didn't have to publish it. Right? So, like, he didn't, it's not literally that he forgot. This is a dramatic fiction again, but he's saying, he's basically in, like, letting us forget what his business is for a moment, and then sharply bringing our attention back to it. I forget, my business is not to recommend virtue. So what is my business? My business is just to understand what it is that we call virtue. Now, he says here that he forgets. And he goes into a little praise of benevolence before he remembers that he shouldn't be doing that. Later, as we'll see, towards the end of the book, all of a sudden he changes his tune and said, oh, but wait, actually, I better try to recommend virtue. And then when he suddenly starts talking about that, he says some very surprising things. So I'll talk about that next time. But at least for now, Hume's story is that he's not responsible for telling you why it's good to be virtuous, why that deserves praise, why you should try to be that way. He's just going to describe what it is that you mean when you say something is virtuous, like what characteristics it has to have for you to praise it or blame it. And the only test of whether he's right is whether it's empirically correct. Okay, so that's the question. What is the true origin of morals? And it's an empirical question, and it's a question not involved in recommending virtues, but just in understanding what they all have in common. Now, not to keep you in suspense, the main answer to this question, what is the true origin of morals, will turn out to be social utility. That is, Hume is going to claim that the main reason we praise certain characters or actions is that they're useful to society. And the main reason we blame certain characters or actions is that they're harmful to society. The book is mostly organized according to virtues, but he, discusses the opposite vices sometimes as well. So anyway, he's going to claim that the main reason we consider things, certain characters or actions praiseworthy, is that they're useful to society. Now, this is kind of ambiguous, right? And utility, by the way, I mean, I guess, because this has a kind of technical sound to it and is used in economics in a certain way and whatever, it may sound more mysterious than it is. Utility just means usefulness. Social utility means useful society. Useful for what? Well, I think Hume agrees with Locke that evidently useful in the end means useful for the members of society to get pleasure and avoid pain. But it's important. The definition of utility is that the thing that's useful doesn't itself have to be pleasurable. That has nothing to do with it. The question is whether it can be used as a means to get something that we want. Right. So social, so that's utility is usefulness, and social means to society. But this is right away brings up an important ambiguity. Which society? What society does it have to be useful to? And the answer to that is actually going to be very important to Hume's whole argument. So it's important to focus on what the answer is. Namely, that the society it's useful to is the society of the virtuous person. Right? So in other words, if you describe someone to me and I say based on the characteristics that you've described them as having, oh, that's a virtuous person. What I mean is that person is useful to whatever society they're a member of, not necessarily to my society. Right? And if their society is at war with my society, then I may actually be very upset that they have a virtuous person on their side, right? It may be very bad for me. But that doesn't, or at least isn't supposed to, affect my moral praise, right? So in other words, of course, it may bias me. Right? Like if the person who's described to me, if I know, you don't just tell me it's some person who knows who, but you tell me it's the general of the opposite army that I'm fighting against, then I may be biased in my judgments, right? Because I don't want to have to love the general of the opposite army for being virtuous. So, but what Hume is claiming is that we see that as bias, right? That is, we see that as irrelevant to the correct moral conclusion. This goes together with what he already said in section 1 about when he's talking about how sentiment and reason might be reconciled, how they might both play an important role in these moral conclusions. This doesn't seem to be marked in the book, but right. So he compares the case of moral beauty or deformity, that is virtue or vice, to certain kinds of beauty, strictly speaking, right? Like aesthetic beauty. And he says that in many orders of beauty, particularly those of the finer arts, it is requisite to employ much reasoning in order to feel the proper sentiment, and a false relish may frequently be corrected by argument and reflection. Oh no, my minicam. Oh, that's from a long time ago. All right. Okay, so right, what he's saying here is that in the case, and whether I agree with this, whether we should agree with this, I'm not sure, but uh, it's definitely something that would have received wide agreement in the 18th century, at least, that, in order to know what is a good play or poem or a bad play or poem or piece of music or painting, even, um, a lot of times it's necessary to have some knowledge of the principles of poetry and drama and so forth, and to apply them properly. And then when you do, you'll see the beauty of the piece. But if you kind of make a misapplication there, you won't see it. And then someone can come along and say, oh, but look, what you're not understanding is how, you know, this does this and that does that, and etc. And then you'll say, oh, now I see, it's a beautiful poem or whatever. um, uh, we kind of at least act as if we still believe that in a lot of cases, right? I mean, we do. If someone says, oh, I think that's a terrible band or movie or something, you won't often find people just saying, oh, well, I guess you have your opinion. A lot of times they'll say, but look, there's this, the other. They'll give reasons, right? So Hume is saying chances are moral sentiment is like that. Um, the final verdict, as he put it, is delivered by sentiment. But to get in the position to make the judgment correctly, or that is to have the right sentiment, it may take a lot of reasoning and rational correction. And I think in this case of the general of the opposite army, you can see how that kind of thing can go, how that makes sense, right? Like my initial reaction is negative and I want to blame this person. But then someone says to me, you know, imagine that this person were a general on your side and compare them to so and what's the difference really, and right, make all these arguments, and after a while I'll say, oh yeah, I was biased, and I'll correct my sentiment. um, right, so, and all of that is why this answer, the society of the virtuous person, is so important. It's I mean, I guess society to begin with is important because it means not just useful to me. That's already a bias that I'm going to have to start correcting for, as Hume will discuss later. But it means not even just useful to my society. That's, right? I have to try to consider this person as if I were a member of their society and stood to benefit from them, from their usefulness. So notice that even though this view is maybe based on the same psychological hedonism that we found in Locke, that is, Hume may agree with that, the, um, the view about what we call virtuous and what we call vicious, what those things have in common, is not evidently hedonistic. I mean, of course, as I said before, what's praiseworthy does please me in some way, right? It draws my affections towards it, all other things being equal. I mean, all other things probably need not be equal. So the opposite, the general, the opposite enemy, I may still hate and fight, even though I have to acknowledge that they're praiseworthy. But insofar as the moral sentiment goes, yes, I'm going to be pleased with this person to the extent that I find them praiseworthy. But it's not that I find them praiseworthy because they please me. That would be the hedonist position. right? In this case, I have to decide something else about them, which has nothing to do with my pleasure. And Hume brings these examples of like reading about people in ancient history and finding them praiseworthy. So, they presumably didn't do anything to cause me pleasure or pain, or anyway, if they did, there's no way to trace it from them to me. It's too much has happened in between, right? So it's not like I encountered them and said, "Oh, they're pleasing to me, and that's why I praise them." It's the other way around. I encountered them. I saw certain things about them that made them praiseworthy, and that's why I'm pleased with them. That's the position. Um, that's also going to bring up a psychological question. And this is what he's going to conclude in going to discuss in section 5 that we're reading for next time. So, wait, why do people try to be morally virtuous? Okay. Would Hume discriminate between virtue at different levels of society, like my social utility for my neighborhood versus my country? Yeah, that's a good question. So he actually discusses that explicitly he keeps coming back to it, in fact, that the same character that in a private person will be pleasant to their immediate associates if that person is raised by fortune or birth to an exalted station, is going to have benevolent or going to have good effects on the society as a whole, and to its future and so forth. So this is yet another way in which the moral sentiment requires that we correct for certain things, according to Hume. Right? So, it's natural that the person who's, this could happen in different ways. It's natural that the person who I'm an associate with, who's a private person and whose usefulness is mostly for their associates, is going to be especially lovable to me, especially amiable, right? Amiable means lovable. So on the other hand, the person who's really useful to the whole society is going to, if I look at all their effects together, there's going to be a much stronger impression of usefulness, and in that respect, there's going to be a tendency for me to love them more. Whereas someone who's useful only to their associates, and I'm not one of their associates, there's going to be a tendency for me not to care about. But when I form the moral judgment, I look at the character and I say, is this the type of character that tends to be useful to this person's circle of influence, whether wide or narrow? And in that way, I could end up judging all those three people to be equally virtuous, right? Even though their effects are very different. One of them has a lot of effect on me, but not on most other people. One of them has effects on everyone. And the third one has effects on some other people, not me. But when I just focus on their character and say, is the character socially useful, I may end up judging that I may end up feeling the same moral sentiment about all of them. So the moral sentiment is a kind of sentiment that we reach by abstraction, is one way of putting it. Although Hume doesn't say that, but that's pretty much what's going on here, right? Like, by ignoring everything about a certain character except its social utility in the abstract, right? Without knowing what society the person belongs to, how much influence they have, and so on and so forth. We focus just on that, and then we see what sentiment it strikes us with. Does that help answer that question? All right, I hope so. I don't know. Anyway, okay.
Mom, can you put salt in there?
What was I going to say? So, actually, maybe I should talk about this later. Well, no, I guess I'll just mention it briefly. So the society that plays a role in the definition of social utility, and therefore in Hume's answer to this question, is the society of the virtuous person. However, when Hume eventually answers that other question in section 5, so why does moral praise or blame motivate us? If it abstracts from what is pleasant or painful to us and considers only some abstract question. So in that case, Hume is going to talk about the way interactions in a society kind of separate out this abstract basis of sentiment. And even if it starts off weak compared to others, right, like more selfish bases, end up, because of the way people interact in society, end up making it much stronger, amplifying it. And in that case, of course, he's going to be talking about our society, right? That is the society in which the praisers or blamers live, is the one in which we learn what things to praise or blame. So, in that respect, it may be important to ask whether Hume's understanding of what society is like is really universal, or whether he's talking about some particular kind of society. Okay, but I think, as I said, I will come back to that next time. All right, so this is the main answer. Now, there's a bunch of other answers. They're described in sections 6 through 8, which I didn't assign. There's several other reasons that we praise qualities in people, and basically we praise qualities that are useful to the person themselves. So again, it's not useful to me, but useful to that person. Even though they may not be socially useful. That's some characters we praise for that reason. And sometimes we praise qualities that are immediately agreeable, either to the person themselves or to their associates, right? So immediately, like, in other words, it's social utility is the main one, but we also consider personal utility to the person in question. And we also consider, besides utility, we consider immediate agreeableness, right? So again, utility, something is useful if I want it because I can get something else. But something is immediately agreeable if I just like it, right? Like, so for example, Hume says that wittiness or a sense of humor is regarded as a virtue. Now, this is a little bit worrying because it's certainly not true in all societies. It's true in Hume's society. Anyway, but like wittiness or a sense of humor is considered a virtue. Why? It's not socially useful, but it's immediately agreeable to the person's associates, right? It makes them happier. It's not useful for something else. It's something you want for its own sake. Okay, so, but those are at least the way Hume presents things, kind of the minor reasons. I mean, the truth is that in chapter 6, Hume actually discusses most of the traditional virtues that you find listed in Aristotle or Plato, right? Like courage, prudence, temperance, whatever. Those are all listed under useful to the person themselves. So from that point of view, maybe it's not that minor. But Hume assumes we'll agree, or perhaps would like to encourage us to agree, that the main two virtues he's going to discuss, namely benevolence and justice, are actually much more deserving of praise than those traditional virtues of courage, temperance, etc. Okay, so so the method of showing this, how is Hume going to try to prove this? The method is that he's going to collect lots of examples. Well, actually, two examples, basically. He's going to collect the main examples of virtues and their opposite vices. He assumes that we're more or less going to agree on what those are, right? In fact, it turns out that we can so take for granted, I guess, based on previous experience, right? I mean, this is not something itself we could know by demonstrative reasoning. Excuse me. But we can so take for granted that everyone's going to more or less agree on them that right? He says these sentiments of praise for personal merit, praise and blame for personal merit, are so universal among mankind. Oh, sorry. The sentence is too complicated for me to truncate. But anyway, he's saying it's so universal among mankind that it gives us a philosopher sufficient assurance that he can never be considerably mistaken in framing the catalogue or incur any danger of misplacing the objects of his contemplation. He needs only enter into his own breast for a moment and consider whether or not he should desire to have this or that quality ascribed to him, etc. Right? So we can so assume that people are going to agree that benevolence and justice are virtues, and that malevolence and injustice are vices, that we don't have to base our conclusions about that on any actual empirical work. Just look into your own breasts and you'll see that, yeah, you would consider calling someone benevolent praise. Or if someone called you benevolent, you would consider that praise, etc. Not, however, that Hume assumes that people agree completely about what character counts as virtuous or what counts as vicious. And in fact, he often uses the variability of moral judgments as a kind of experiment to prove that his theory is right. That is, he'll take some apparently discordant fact that, like, people used to think X was virtuous, but now they think it's vicious, something like that. And he'll say, well, that's not mysterious. It's just because they've changed their mind about whether it's socially useful or not. So, for example, if we were to say, Hume, and so this is one of the things he says about the virtue of chastity. He says that we blame the opposite vice, non-chastity, whatever the opposite of chastity is, probably something nasty. Anyway, we consider this virtue much more important in women than in men, Hume says. And why? Well, he says, because although it's socially useful for both genders to be chaste, it's much more socially useful for the women because everyone knows who the mother is, but you can't be sure who the father is, right? That's, and assuming it's socially useful to know who both the parents are, that would be the explanation. So it's, in other words, it's more socially harmful for the woman to act in such a way as to raise questions about who might be the father. Whether that's coherent or not, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, there had to be a man involved also to raise questions about who is the father. I don't know if that really makes sense, but in any case, if we said to Hume, look, you're wrong. We don't hold by your double standard. Right? We think, I mean, I guess we wouldn't call it chastity exactly, but we think, I mean, fidelity, not cheating on your partner is virtuous, but we don't think it's like more virtuous for women than it is for men. Hume could say, oh, well, you have birth control, right? This is exactly what my theory predicts. Now, again, I don't know if this is right, but Hume would, like, the point is, although this is an empirical question, Hume's answer, social utility, is an answer which can explain a lot of empirical variability, and he considers it to be one of its virtues, so to speak, that that it can be used that way. Now, if you were to turn around and say, but look, Hume, we just said we don't approve of this double standard, and you're upholding it, so we don't approve of you. Explain it how you like, but we don't like you, go away. Then Hume can say, well, hold on, I didn't recommend the double standard, I was just explaining it. This is, I mean, this position that Hume has put himself in by framing the question this way is really clever, right? He's able to be a moral relativist in the sense that he can take the phenomenon he's describing to be different in different cultures, but he doesn't have to commit himself to agreeing with one culture or another. Now, I mean, that doesn't mean that he might not still get in trouble by taking something to be universal, right? Like what I was saying about sense of humor. You'd think he would know that. Actually, he does know that. He talks about how people used to value these useless monkish virtues of silence and fasting and, you know, whatever. Yeah, as usual, Hume is more slippery. However, you know, however much you think you've got behind him, he's always a little bit more tricky than that. But in any case, I mean, whatever he can say on that particular point, let's take the example of sense of humor. You know, I mean, Hume might take that to be universal when in fact it's just something that characterizes a very specific social class and society and even gender that he has. Probably he does do that sometimes. Maybe I'll even point out an example other than that. But and that will mean that some of his evidence that he gathered by going inside his own breast, we might really reject. Okay, so, but anyway, that was all kind of a long digression in the middle of the sentence. The sentence was, the method is going to be to collect these examples of virtue and vice, and then try to show what it is that makes us praise or esteem them, or blame, or whatever the opposite of esteem is, contemn them. That's because the opposite of esteem is contempt, right? So, and in particular, what he's going to try to do is show that what the things that we praise as benevolent have in common is that largely that they're socially useful, and that's largely how we identify them for praise. Um, and he's going to try to show the same thing in the case of justice. Um, and then there's a bunch more that he discusses afterwards under the heading of political society, such as allegiance, chastity, good manners, and playing by the rules in games, and some other miscellaneous cases. And in all those cases, he's going to say that the main or sometimes the only reason we praise or blame them is because of their social usefulness. Um, so there are questions about any of that so far? Okay, so as I've been saying, the two big examples are benevolence and justice. Now, justice is the more interesting one, and also, I guess, brought into relief by certain current events. um, but benevolence is a little bit interesting too, so I'll talk about that first. In the case of benevolence, Hume says that the basis for our praise of benevolence is, at least in part, its social utility. Um, what might the other parts be? Well, for example, that benevolence is personally useful. Now, I mean, uh, um, I guess, there's different ways benevolence can be considered personally useful. One kind of presupposes that society, by and large, approves of benevolence, right? Which is that if you're benevolent, people will be nice to you back. Um, but even beyond that, I think Hume thinks part of our praise of benevolence is based on the fact that it's more pleasant to be benevolent. Right. So, I mean, I guess actually that's so sorry. The first one was personally useful. The second one is personally immediately agreeable. Right. That it's actually it feels bad to be mean, and it feels good to be nice. Um, but so that may be part of the basis of our praise of benevolence, Hume says, but mostly it's because of the social utility. And he tries to show that um, number one, just by pointing out that when we praise someone for their benevolence, we typically mention its utility, right? So when we say so and so is is really great because they're benevolent, right? Like so and so is a really nice person, I guess is the way we would say it now, maybe. That doesn't mean exactly the same thing as benevolent. I'm not sure. But in any case, we say so and so is such a nice person, then we immediately start saying, like, what all the good things are that result from their being a nice person. So and so is such a nice person. All the students in their program are happy. All their colleagues love them. All their whatever, right? Because they, et cetera, et cetera. Like pointing out how useful they were to their associates. And similarly, if we were talking about someone in a higher station, like a political leader, we would talk about the great effects that their benevolence had on their nation and maybe even other nations. Um, so that's a big part of the proof. I guess it's fairly convincing. If is it true? I guess it's true. I'm not sure. I mean, uh, I guess it's true, and if true, it's fairly convincing, right? If every time you praise someone for X, you point out to build up your praise how socially useful it is that they are X, then that's probably a good sign that you approve of X because it's socially useful. Um, he also has a couple of examples that are supposed to show, as I said before, right, this is one of the cases where he's doing a kind of experiment. They're supposed to show that altered views about what is socially useful will alter our opinion as to what kind of benevolence is praiseworthy. So, at least that's the purported reason for those examples. So again, this is a place where Hume is being a little tricky. This is in section 2, page 19. It's just, you always have to be on your toes with him to figure out what he's doing. So here's one of the examples. Can anything stronger be said in praise of a profession, such as, actually, maybe this isn't, I guess it's implicitly one of those examples. Can anything stronger be said in praise of a profession, such as merchandising or manufacture, than to observe the advantages which it procures to society? And is not a monk, an inquisitor, enraged when we treat his order as useless or pernicious to mankind? Right, so implicitly what Hume is saying here is that people used to think that the most praiseworthy professions were monk and inquisitor because they thought that those professions were very socially useful. But now, and they used to think that merchant and manufacturer were contemptible or even blameworthy professions because they thought of them as socially useless, right? I mean, I guess, he's alluding to the old farmers' complaints that the farmers produce everything and they only get a little bit of money for it, and then the merchants take it and they don't do anything and they just bring it somewhere else and they get rich. So it's a very useless thing they do. And they don't deserve the reward they got for it, and so it's blameworthy. And Hume is saying, but I mean, well, so Hume is saying implicitly, now we know better, right? Now we understand how. And by the way, if you ask why people thought a monk was socially useful, like, I mean, you might think it's, well, because the monks are praying for us or something like that. And I mean, I guess that's part of what he's talking about, but probably more important was that monasteries were, like, monks had a duty of hospitality. So a monastery was a place you could go to get free food. And a lot of people used to. Anyway, so Hume is saying, like, nowadays we know better. We understand that the merchant and the manufacturer are actually, adding most of the value and making our economy grow and so on and so forth. And we realize that they're very useful, whereas those monks with their hospitality are just encouraging indolence, right? They're just encouraging people to freeload off them. And in order to support that, they force or persuade people into giving them lots of money. That's a very useless thing, right? They transfer money from productive people to unproductive people. And the inquisitor, well, obviously. So Hume says, now we've learned that those are the socially harmful ones, and the other is the socially useful one, and we've reversed our praise and blame. And the other example he gives, which I won't read from the book, but it's actually two examples. One is about giving alms to beggars, and the other is about tyrannicide, that is killing illegitimate rulers. And he says both of these used to be considered very virtuous before people realized that they were socially pernicious rather than useful. And right, giving alms to beggars is supposed to be socially pernicious, again, because it encourages, um, it discourages industry and encourages sloth or something like that. And tyrannicide is supposed to be socially pernicious because if kings are afraid of being assassinated, they'll be much harsher on their subjects. So it's better to have a code that the king's person is sacred. Um, Now, I mean, the reason I said Hume is tricky is that when he raises just these examples, he has to be aware that they're still very controversial in the 18th century. It's not like everyone has come to agree that merchants and manufacturers are socially useful, or that monks and inquisitors are not, or that giving alms to common beggars or tyrannicide are bad things. So, I mean, Hume is both using this as examples, but also kind of like advertising his own position, like insinuating it. And if you don't believe that he knew these things are still controversial in his time, just read his history of England, his discussion of the gunpowder plot, for example, and what people would say on either side of the question of tyrannicide. He knew that it wasn't really true that everyone agreed with him about this, but he means that everyone enlightened agrees about this, and you should too. You want to be enlightened, right? Okay, anyway, that's all I want to say about benevolence. Unless, are there questions about benevolence? Then we go on to talk about justice, because I think that's the really interesting one. And as I said, it's also, there are a lot of little passages in this chapter, and I don't know if I will get to, and I don't even know if it would necessarily be good for me to get to making these connections explicitly, but there are a lot of passages in this chapter that, given the events of the last few days, like, stand out. I mean, not that because they help settle some of the doubts and confusion that we're in, but because they, I don't know, show how deep these issues really go and how old they are. But in any case, so what Hume means by justice is pretty circumscribed in a sense. Justice basically means respect for property. Right? As I think I said before in this class, justice, Simonides' definition of justice in the that's quoted in the Republic is that justice is giving to each the things that are due, or something like that. So, I mean, that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, but actually, the initial way the interlocutors in the Republic treat it is that it means making sure everyone gets their property and not someone else's property. And that's what Hume takes it to mean. Right? This virtue of justice is the virtue of accurately determining and respecting what is mine and what is yours. And his claim is that in this case, our praise of this virtue derives wholly from social utility. That the only reason that we think it's praiseworthy to respect other people's property is that it's useful for society if everyone does that. Now, he mostly takes it for granted that everyone agrees it is useful for society if everyone does that. He doesn't completely take it for granted, though, right? He starts off the discussion by saying, look, if you asked a being who had no knowledge of, a rational being who had no knowledge of human nature, what would be the right way to distribute scarce goods? And this all goes on. I mean, he's going to relax this assumption in a thought experiment, but it all goes on under the assumption that nature by itself, at least without our industry, is not sufficient to keep all of us comfortable and happy. Maybe not sufficient to support us all at all. I mean, that's certainly true now, right? Like if all 7.5 billion of us suddenly tried to live off wild things we picked in nature, there wouldn't be nature very long. So anyway, so right, that's the assumption here, and he says, tell a rational being, we have some scarce goods to distribute. What would be the most socially useful way to distribute them? He says, well, the obvious answer would be to give them to people in proportion to their goodness, where goodness basically means benevolence, right? I mean, benevolence combined maybe with some of the other virtues that make benevolence useful, right? And those, we don't want to give the scarce goods to people who are going to wish well to everyone but not do anything about it because they're too disorganized or lazy or whatever. But we want to make sure that the most goods go to the people who are going to use them most effectively to help everyone else. So he says that would be the obvious way of distributing it if you didn't know anything about human nature. But once you do know something about human nature, you realize that we have no way of telling who those people are. That in any case, we have no peaceful and reliable way of telling who they are. As soon as you put the question that way, everyone will start to say, I'm the most benevolent, right? And, or at least a lot of people will. And some will choose some, and some will choose others. And everything will degenerate into chaos. So he says although that seems like it would be more socially useful than the system of property that we have, it really isn't. And then he considers another system, which is the system of equal distribution, which he says this also, on the face of it, seems more reasonable than the system we use. Why does it seem more reasonable? He says that, look, if you took all the things that everyone is able to produce, so now we're not just talking about the raw products of nature, but if you took all the things that everyone is able to produce and you divided them equally, he says everyone would be fairly comfortable. Whereas the way things are now, a lot of extra goods are bestowed where they don't help very much, right? So he's, this is someone who's already very rich. Like their next dollar you give them doesn't do them any, a special good. It just will serve to satisfy some fanciful whim or whatever. And meanwhile, the fact that you've taken it away from the poor people who would otherwise be comfortable but are now maybe starving, it seems like the utility of giving all that money to the rich person is small. Whereas the disutility of taking it away from all those poor people is large. So it seems like that would be a more reasonable way, but Hume says, so, again, I think Hume is, under the guise of showing the empirical adequacy of his theory, is also kind of trying to convince you that you should approve of property. Because again, he knows that and he gives examples that not too long ago in England, there were people who were militantly opposed to property and were in favor of one of these two systems he's given. So So anyway, he says that seems like it would be more reasonable, but in fact, it would have huge disadvantages because it would be almost impossible to enforce. If it were possible to enforce, it would need such a heavy enforcement mechanism, right? You would have to constantly keep watch to make sure no one had more than anyone else, that you would end up having to give too much power to someone. And then eventually they would stop using it to enforce your system and start using it for themselves. um, but but he also says that if you really achieved this even distribution, it would be really hard for someone to have that much power, because everyone would be on an equal footing now. So it wouldn't last. And if you could make it last, nevertheless, it would have bad consequences. And this part of the argument should be, I guess, familiar. Whether you agree with it or not, it's a familiar argument about these matters where you say, well, look, it's important that people, because people can't be comfortable at all unless we work really hard to get stuff out of nature. There must be a big reward for that. And that's what the system of property that we have ensures, right? So it begins with whatever I produce, unless I consent to alienate my production to someone else. But anyway, whatever I produce is mine. That's what it starts with, supposedly. Okay, so anyway, maybe I spent more time on that than I should have, although it's definitely also interesting and topical. Um, but so anyway, so his claim is going to be that in fact the system of property that we have is more or less the most socially useful system you could have, and that's why we approve of it. It comes in different variants, both because there's some different systems that are equally useful, and it doesn't matter which one you choose, and because to some extent the details may depend on the characteristics of the people and the country and the agriculture that's possible there and so forth. But for the most part, it's all the same ideas, and we approve of them because they're socially useful, and in fact, not just socially useful, but they're essential for the survival of society. Right? He says human beings couldn't have societies on a certain scale. I guess he means exactly what scale, I don't know. But anyway, human beings couldn't have societies at all on a certain scale unless they approved of, praised, and were motivated by this virtue of justice. And that's the reason it exists. So, how does he prove that? Because, as he points out, I wonder if this is less true than it used to be. He says that when we praise people for being, unlike in the case of benevolence, where he says when we praise someone for their benevolence, we're always focusing on how actually useful they are. He says in the case of justice, we don't often think explicitly of how socially useful it is that people respect the laws of property. We think they're honest, they're decent, they're just. They don't take away things from, right? They're not deceitful and sneaking, and right. So like we don't seem to be focused on their social utility. Basically, he says the reason for that difference is because this one is so much more essential that it's so obvious that we don't think about it anymore. Right? It's so obvious that if people stopped respecting the rules of justice, there would be no more society. Um, um, So, of course, as Hume knows, society is consistent with a huge amount of injustice. Um, that is legal apportionment of property that is not socially useful, let's say. Um, that is um, well, it's not clear exactly how to measure these things, in part because it's not clear exactly who to count as part of society and who not. That's always a dangerous thing, where to draw the lines, right? But you might say um, things, practices that uh, um, either are so disadvantageous to some people that they aren't justified by the utility they give to everyone else, or maybe that even though they appear to be advantageous to some people, they ultimately put everyone in danger by enshrining unjust rules, right? Something like that. I mean, Hume wrote. He died in 1776, so he wrote during the uh, heyday of slavery in the colonies in America. Um, he was an abolitionist, although that doesn't mean he wasn't a racist. He was somewhat racist, but he was not in favor of slavery. I mean, he knows society could consist with a lot of injustice. But I guess, nevertheless, he's still pointing out what Locke himself pointed out, right? Um, Even a band of robbers can't stay together if they don't have some norms for respecting each other's. Norms is not a word they use. They don't have some laws, rules, according to which they respect each other's stuff. All right, so oh boy, I still haven't talked about the most interesting stuff, and now there's only 2 minutes left. I may have to discuss this next week, even though there's 2 other really interesting things to discuss next week. But I guess I'll just say really briefly, the way he tries to prove this then, since he can't appeal, as he does in the case of benevolence, to what we automatically associate with praising justice, he instead appeals to these thought experiments, mostly kind of wild thought experiments, right? Like the society that has more than enough of everything. And he says, in that case, imagine that case, and you'll find that you don't think justice, respect for property, is virtuous in that case. Why? Because it's useless, right? If anyone can get anything they want at any time, it doesn't matter to me if someone takes my thing. I can just take another one right away. Based on my experience of my children and how they share toys, I would say this is not necessarily true of human nature. But in any case,
really rude right now.
We have a counterpoint from Margaret, perhaps. But
I don't know what he's saying about me and sharing my toys, but I don't agree with it.
Well, I'll just say that if they have
he's saying it's a bad thing.
if they have 2 identical toys, they'll go to great lengths to either notice some tiny difference between them or make a difference, like make a mark, in order they can make sure the other one doesn't have theirs. So it seems to me that even in this society, people had everything, maybe. But I guess maybe the point is we wouldn't think it was virtuous in that
case.
Can I
show them an example?
You could, except we're almost out of time. So
okay. You keep doing your...
Well, okay, I have to wrap up. But the point is, maybe his point is right. We can imagine people having property and respecting property in that society, but it would be kind of childish. It would not be socially useful, and therefore wouldn't approve of it. Right? Wouldn't approve of someone saying, no, this is my delicious fruit that just dropped into my hand out of the tree, when another one is just about to drop, right? Yes, there's an example. 2 identical toys that they fight over.
This one has scratches on it. And this one has scratches on its feet more than...
Yes.
So
okay.
This one has more scratches on its feet.
Okay, now you know. So, on that note, I'm sorry to keep you 1 minute after time for that, but I hope it was entertaining, if not instructive. And I will see you on Wednesday. Okay, have a good time. See you. Hey guys, hello?